The gun was already cocked when Sallie Ralston heard the voice. It was not loud. It was not commanding in any theatrical sense. It was barely above a growl, rough as creek gravel dragged across pine bark, and it said exactly 4 words into the suffocating silence of that Deadwood saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1882. Put the gun down. Every man in the room turned. Every man went still. Because in the 3 years that Jeremiah Ford had come down from his mountain cabin twice a month to collect supplies from Colburn's general store, he had never, not once, not in any recorded memory of any breathing soul in the Dakota Territory, spoken a single voluntary word to another human being. He nodded. He pointed at what he wanted. He laid his coins on the counter and walked back out. 10 words. Some men swore it was fewer than that. Old Pete Briggs said the total was 7, including one time Jeremiah had said no twice in a single visit. And now he had spoken 4 words in one breath. The man holding the gun, a broad-shouldered cattle broker named Denton Marsh who smelled of whiskey and old grievances, turned slowly to look at the mountain man standing in the doorway. The October light was harsh behind Jeremiah's frame, and it made him look carved rather than born. 6 feet and 3 inches of dark wool coat, a jaw like a courthouse step, and eyes the specific gray-green color of a river right before it floods. Those eyes were on Sallie Ralston. She was standing behind the bar where she had been working for exactly 11 days, and Denton Marsh had his revolver pointed at the space between her eyes because she had refused to give him a bottle of rye on credit. And credit was something that Sallie had been explicitly told by the saloon's owner, a man named Harold Gibbs, never to extend to Denton Marsh under any circumstances whatsoever. "Who in the hell are you to tell me anything?" Marsh said to Jeremiah. His voice was the kind that had scared women and children for many years without consequence. Jeremiah Ford said nothing. He simply walked into the room, and something extraordinary happened. Marsh lowered the gun. Not because Jeremiah threatened him, not because he pulled a weapon of his own. He simply walked across the sawdust floor of that saloon with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided how things were going to go, and Denton Marsh, for reasons he would struggle to explain later and for a long time after, stepped back, holstered his weapon, and walked out the front door without a single additional word. The room exhaled. Sallie Ralston gripped the bar with both hands. Her knuckles were white, and her heart was hammering with the particular violent rhythm of someone who has just been very close to dying and knows it. She looked at the mountain man who had, for no reason she could identify, just saved her life. He looked back at her, and she did the thing that would change both of their lives entirely. She asked him a question, not "thank you," which would have been easier, not "who are you," which would have been practical. She asked the question that was in her mind before common sense could manage it, because Sallie Ralston had always been the kind of woman whose mind moved faster than her caution. "Are you hungry?" she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had names for yet. Jeremiah Ford looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down at the bar. She took that as a yes. To understand why that question mattered so much, you have to understand who both of them were before that Tuesday in October, before the gun and the silence and the gray-green eyes, and the question that cracked something open in a man who had been sealed shut for years. Sallie Ralston had come to Deadwood, Dakota Territory, by way of a decision she had made standing at a crossroads that was both literal and otherwise, in St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1882. She was 26 years old, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father and a practical mother, educated well enough to know the world was larger than the one being offered to her, and stubborn enough to want more of it than she was being given. She had been engaged. His name was William Colton, and he was a pleasant enough man who worked in banking and had very clean fingernails and held the peculiar conviction that Sallie's opinions were charming as long as they coincided with his own. They had been engaged for 7 months when William had, in a conversation that he clearly believed was a kindness, explained to Sallie that once they were married she would need to stop the business of having so many of her own thoughts about things, because it was unsettling to the people around her. Sallie had given his ring back the following morning. Her mother had cried. Her father had, secretly, been proud. And Sallie had read an advertisement in the back pages of a newspaper that was calling for women willing to work in the establishments of Deadwood, which was a boomtown growing at a speed that produced more opportunity and more danger in equal and exciting measure. The advertisement had been placed by Harold Gibbs, who ran the Silver Nail Saloon, and while Sallie's mother had strong feelings about the nature of saloon work, Sallie had written the letter, sent it, received a response, and packed her trunk in that order, with the kind of decisive momentum that is only available to someone who has decided they are done being afraid of the wrong things. She had arrived in early October, taken the room above the saloon that came with the position, and had been pouring drinks and managing the bar with remarkable competence for 11 days when Denton Marsh had pointed his gun at her. She was not naive about the kind of place she had come to. She had known, walking into the Silver Nail for the first time, that Deadwood in 1882 was a town still raw around its edges, still sorting out which laws applied and which men thought they were above them. The gold rush had peaked, and the people left behind were a complicated mixture of the resilient and the desperate and the dangerous. She had kept her eyes open and her manner professional, and she had, until Denton Marsh, handled every difficult situation with the kind of firm calm that comes from knowing exactly what you will and will not tolerate. But a gun in the face was something else. And then the mountain man had walked in. Now he was sitting at her bar, and she was setting a plate of cold biscuits and sliced salt pork in front of him because that was what the kitchen had ready, and he was eating it with the quiet, focused attention of a man who does not take food for granted. She watched him. She could not quite help it. He was older than she had initially thought in those terrifying few seconds. She would later learn he was 32, and there was a quality to him that was difficult to name. Not handsome in any conventional saloon print way, but his face had the particular beauty of things that have been shaped by hard weather and difficult years, rather than pampered into softness. The gray-green eyes moved occasionally to her face with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely unguarded, which was somehow more unsettling than rudeness would have been. "You come in here often," Sallie said, and then immediately wanted to pull the question back because it sounded ridiculous saloon small talk, as if he had not just calmly faced down an armed drunk on her behalf. He shook his head once. Then after a pause he added, very quietly, "Colburn's." She understood. He came to the general store, not the saloon. "Then why today?" she said. He chewed, considered, looked at his plate, heard the noise. 2 words. She stored them like they were currency. "Well," she said, and she kept her voice even because something in her chest was doing something peculiar that she was not prepared to examine yet. "I'm glad you did." He finished his food. He stood, reached into his coat pocket and laid 2 coins on the bar, more than enough. Then he turned to go. "My name is Sallie Ralston," she said to his back, not because she expected him to turn around. She said it because it seemed important that he know it. He stopped. He did not turn. But he stood still for a moment in a way that meant he had heard and was doing something with the information. "Jeremiah Ford," he said, and then he walked out. She stood there in the quiet of the saloon, the 2 coins on the bar, the empty plate, and the echo of a name. And she thought, with a certainty she could not explain and did not try to, that she was going to see him again. The town of Deadwood had opinions about Jeremiah Ford, the way small towns always have opinions about the people they cannot understand. The opinions were delivered in the particular confident tone that ignorance uses when it wants to sound like wisdom. "He was antisocial," said Reverend Hawk. "He was peculiar," said the women who collected laundry on Tuesdays. "He had killed men," said the men who drank at the Silver Nail, though none of them could name when or where with any precision, which suggested the story had grown in the space between evidence and imagination. What was actually known, in factual terms, was simpler and sadder than the legends. Jeremiah Ford had come to the Dakota Territory in 1877 from somewhere in Tennessee. He had, for a brief period, worked a claim like everyone else, with a partner named Clay Doss, who had been his closest and possibly only friend. The claim had been small but productive for a season, and then in the winter of 1878 Clay Doss had been shot dead on the trail between the claim and town by men who wanted what was in his pack. Jeremiah had found his partner's body frozen in the morning light on that trail, and something in him had closed. Not violently, not dramatically, the way stories prefer. Just quietly, the way a door shuts in an empty house, and the sound travels through the rooms and then there is nothing. He had sold the claim. He had built himself a cabin 9 miles into the Black Hills above town, on a plateau that most men would have found inhospitable. He had, over the 5 years since, developed a system of subsistence that required almost no interaction with other human beings. He trapped. He kept a small garden in summer. He came to town twice a month for flour, salt, coffee, and occasionally nails or lamp oil, conducted these transactions in absolute silence, and returned to his mountain. He was not hostile. That was the thing that confused people. He never threatened anyone, never raised his voice, never caused a moment of trouble. He simply did not speak, and in a world built entirely on the exchange of words, news, gossip, commerce, friendship, love, a man who would not speak was a man who did not exist in any social sense, and people are not entirely comfortable with that kind of absence. He had not been unhappy precisely in those 5 years. He had been anesthetized. There is a difference, though from the outside it can look identical. On the morning after the incident at the Silver Nail, Jeremiah Ford went about his regular routine on the mountain with the same careful efficiency he always did. He checked his trap lines. He split wood for the approaching winter. He ate breakfast in his cabin at the table he had built himself, looking out the single window at the slope of pine and aspen that fell away toward the valley below. But something was different. He did not name it because naming things was not a habit he had kept. But he was aware of it the way you are aware of a stone in your boot, not debilitating but present, impossible to fully ignore. The question had been so simple. Are you hungry? Not who are you? Not what are you doing here? Not thank you in the obligatory way that people say thank you when they are scared and want to fill the silence with something. Are you hungry? Direct, practical, human, and her eyes when she said it. Not frightened anymore, though she had every right to still be frightened. Clear and brown and entirely unafraid of the strange, silent man who had walked into her saloon and whom she had never met before in her life. He spent 3 days not thinking about it, which is its own form of thinking about it, and on the 4th day he came back into town a full week before his scheduled supply run. He stood outside the Silver Nail for approximately 2 minutes, which was 2 minutes longer than any previous hesitation in his adult life, and then he went in. It was mid-afternoon and quiet. 2 men played cards at a table near the window. Sallie Ralston was behind the bar going over what appeared to be a ledger, her dark hair pinned up with the particular practical economy of a woman who is there to work rather than to be looked at, though the effect was more attractive than the intention. She looked up when he came in. "Jeremiah Ford," she said, and something in her voice did a thing he could not categorize. It lifted, not with surprise exactly, but with something adjacent to pleasure, and the sound of his own name in that tone was strange and new and not unpleasant. He sat at the bar. She closed the ledger. "Coffee," she said. He nodded. She poured it and set it in front of him, and then she said, with the matter-of-fact directness that he would come to think of as one of her defining qualities, "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did the other day. I didn't get the chance." He looked at his coffee. "It was nothing," he said. Both words felt rusty from disuse, like hinges that needed oil. "It was not nothing," she said firmly. "Denton Marsh is not a man who stops when he decides to do a thing. You stopped him. That matters." He had no answer for that, so he drank his coffee. She did not fill the silence with noise, which was something he registered and appreciated immediately. Most people faced with his quiet felt compelled to talk until something gave. She simply worked, wiped the bar down, restocked the glasses on the shelf behind her, and was perfectly comfortable in the space between words. "You live up on the mountain," she said eventually. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," he said. "Alone?" "Yes." She considered this without apparent judgment. "That must be cold in winter." "It is," he agreed. She glanced at him sideways then, a quick assessing look that took him in, and filed something away. "How long have you been up there?" He had to count. 5 years. She nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed rather than learned. He finished his coffee. He stood to leave. And then, because something had shifted in those few minutes that he did not fully understand but did not want to leave unaddressed, he said, "You are new here." She raised an eyebrow. 11 days new. "Alone?" he asked, and then felt immediately uncertain whether the question was appropriate, but she answered it without apparent offense. "Very much alone," she said. "Came from St. Louis, left things behind, starting fresh." She said it simply, like facts, without asking for sympathy. He stood at the bar for one more moment. "Deadwood is not an easy place to be alone," he said. It was the longest sequence of words he had produced in 5 years, and something in his chest felt strange at the end of it, as if a long unused muscle had been called on. Sallie looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "No," she said, "it is not, but neither is wherever you are." He had no answer for that either, but he thought about it for the entire 9-mile walk back up the mountain. October deepened into the kind of cold that the Dakota Territory does with particular authority, stripping the aspen to bare silver and hardening the mud in the streets of Deadwood into something resembling iron. Jeremiah began to come into town more frequently. He told himself various practical reasons for this. He needed additional supplies before the heavy snows. The weather required more lamp oil. Certain items were better obtained sooner rather than later. None of these explanations were entirely false, but none of them were the real reason, and on some fundamental level he knew it. The real reason was that he had started talking again, in the specific context of a bar stool at the Silver Nail, and a woman with brown eyes who listened with the patience of someone who understood that some things take time to say. It did not happen all at once. There was no single conversation where everything opened up. It was a process of incremental trust, built in daily or every other day installments, each one adding another board to a bridge that had been burned and was now, for reasons neither of them entirely controlled, being rebuilt. She told him things too, about St. Louis, about her father's schoolhouse and her mother's opinions about the proper ambitions of women, about the engagement she had ended and the relief she had felt that had surprised her with its depth. She told these things not as confessions but as simple sharing, offering information the way you offer someone a chair here. "This might be useful, sit with it if you like." He found, gradually, that he had things to offer in return. Not big things at first. Observations. The particular pattern of weather that the Black Hills made in late fall, the behavior of the elk on the northern ridge, the way the creek below his cabin sounded different in different seasons, how it had a different voice entirely in spring runoff than in the dry August weeks. She listened to all of it as if it mattered, which was more disarming than anything she could have said. One afternoon in early November, she asked him about Clay Doss. Not because she had been prying. She had heard the story in pieces from various townspeople by then, the way you piece together a person's history in a small town through layered fragments and partial accounts, each one offering something the others did not. She had the general shape of it before she asked, but she wanted to know the truth of it, not the legend. "I heard you had a partner," she said, "when you first came here." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. She did not push. "Clay Doss," he said finally. "Yes." "What was he like?" Something happened in Jeremiah's face then, something complicated and old. "The kind of man who made things seem possible," he said. Whatever was difficult, he had a way of looking at it that made it smaller. She was quiet, letting him have that without comment. "He was shot," Jeremiah said, "on the trail for what he was carrying." "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It was 5 years ago." "That does not make it smaller," she said, and then she added very carefully, "Is that why you stopped talking?" He looked up at her. Nobody had ever asked that directly. The whole town had theories, but nobody had simply asked him. "I suppose it was," he said. "There did not seem to be much point." "And now," she said, he met her eyes. "There seems to be more point than there was," he said, and he meant it as a plain statement of fact, but the way she looked when he said it told him it had landed as something more. The first time he helped her with something beyond the incident with Marsh was in the second week of November, when Harold Gibbs, the saloon owner, came back from a month away with a man he introduced as his nephew, a young man named Cyrus Gibbs, who had the particular combination of entitlement and incompetence that tends to produce maximum damage in a short time. Harold Gibbs was not a bad man. He was a businessman of the frontier type, practical, self-interested, not unkind but not going to spend capital on kindness when profit was available. He had hired Sallie because she was competent and honest, and those qualities were difficult to find in Deadwood. He had returned to find the accounts in better order than he had left them, which had visibly surprised him, and he had been generous enough to acknowledge that she had done well. But Cyrus Gibbs was a problem. He took an immediate interest in Sallie that was not professional in any respect, and he expressed this interest with the confidence of a man who had been told his whole life that what he wanted, he could have. Sallie handled him with the precise combination of coolness and professionalism that is the most effective tool available to a woman in her situation: clear, firm, not hostile but absolutely not yielding. This worked for approximately 3 days. On the 4th day, Cyrus made a remark to her that crossed a line that should not be crossed in front of several customers, and when Sallie told him in very clear terms what she thought of his remark and what would happen if he repeated anything like it, he reacted the way entitlement always reacts to refusal, with anger that framed itself as wounded dignity. Jeremiah was at the bar when this happened. He had been listening without appearing to listen, in the way he had developed over 5 years of solitude, a heightened awareness of his surroundings that operated mostly below the surface of his visible attention. When Cyrus stepped behind the bar toward Sallie, Jeremiah stood up. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, which had its own considerable effect given his dimensions, and he said, "That is her side of the bar." Cyrus Gibbs looked at him. He was young enough and reckless enough to consider pushing it, but he looked at Jeremiah's face and made the pragmatic decision. Harold Gibbs, who had seen all of this from a table near the back, called his nephew over, and there was a quiet but pointed conversation that resulted in Cyrus spending considerably less time in the saloon's front room after that. That evening, when the last customers had gone and the Silver Nail was quiet except for the wind working at the window frames, Sallie was wiping down the bar and Jeremiah was finishing a late coffee, and she said, without looking up from what she was doing, "You keep appearing when I need you to appear." "It is not by calculation," he said. She looked up at that, and she was smiling, which did something particular to the quality of the light in the room, or possibly just to the quality of Jeremiah's ability to think clearly. "I know that," she said. "That is what makes it remarkable." He walked home that night, and the mountain felt different under his boots. Not smaller, not less wild, not changed in any material way, but different in the way that familiar places become different when you are no longer inhabiting them alone in your mind. He had not been lonely, he had told himself, for 5 years, and it had been true in the sense that a man who has never tasted salt cannot miss it. But now he had tasted something again, and the 5 years of not missing it felt suddenly like a loss he had not known he was carrying. November grew heavier with cold and with something else, something building between two people who were both intelligent enough to know what was happening and both, for different reasons, careful about saying it. There was the afternoon she brought him a piece of dried apple pie from the kitchen, because someone had mentioned in passing that he had not eaten anything sweet in. And he had said this offhandedly, meaning nothing by it, probably 3 years, and she had gone and gotten it without comment and set it in front of him, and gone back to what she was doing as if it were the most ordinary thing. And he had sat there with the pie for a moment before eating it, and the ordinariness of the gesture had been more affecting than any elaborate gesture would have been. There was the evening she told him she was frightened. Not of anything specific in that moment, but of the broader shape of her situation. A woman alone in a boomtown without family, without anyone she fully trusted, doing work that was respectable but precarious, in a place where precarious was the default condition of most things. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, not asking for reassurance but just saying the truth of it. And Jeremiah had listened and then said, "You are not as alone as you were 11 days ago." She had been quiet for a moment and then she had said, "No, I don't think I am." There was the morning. He had stayed in town the previous night because an early snowstorm had made the trail back impassable, and Harold Gibbs had let him sleep in the storeroom. When she came downstairs early and found him already awake, sitting at the bar in the empty saloon with a cup of coffee he had made himself, and she had come and sat beside him, not behind the bar, beside him on the customer's side. And they had watched the snow come down through the saloon window and drunk coffee together in comfortable silence that was entirely different from the silence he had been living in for 5 years, because this one was shared. He learned things about her in this period that he filed carefully in some internal catalog he had not needed to maintain in years. She was afraid of almost nothing: practical physical danger, financial uncertainty, social isolation. But she was afraid of becoming invisible. Not literally. She was afraid of the particular invisibility that happened to women who were too accommodating, who smoothed themselves into the shapes others required of them until the original shape was gone. This was, he understood, related to the engagement she had ended, but it ran deeper than that. It was a fundamental understanding she had arrived at about herself, that she needed to be seen as she actually was, not as anyone's preferred version of her. He understood this better than she knew. It was, in a different form, what had happened to him. The version of himself that still spoke, that still reached toward people, had been buried under years of protection until he had almost forgotten it was there. She was, in some way he could not fully articulate, unburying it. The moment Jeremiah Ford acknowledged to himself, without room for any further evasion, that he was in love with Sallie Ralston was an ordinary moment, which is almost always how these things happen. It was the first day of December. He had walked the 9 miles down the mountain in light snow and come into the Silver Nail at mid-morning, which was now a pattern that several people in Deadwood had noticed and were forming opinions about. And she was arguing with the man who delivered supplies to the saloon about a discrepancy in the account, pointing at a figure in the ledger with one finger, and explaining with complete patience and iron certainty why the numbers did not add up in the supplier's favor. The supplier was a large man with a beard and the defensive bluster of someone who expected women to defer. He was getting louder. She was getting quieter and more precise, which Jeremiah had come to understand was what she did when she was certain she was right. She reduced rather than amplified, stripped everything down to the essential fact, and the essential fact in this case was that the numbers were wrong. Jeremiah sat at the bar and drank his coffee and watched her win the argument without raising her voice once, watched the supplier leave with a corrected receipt, and the particular posture of a man who has lost a thing he expected to keep. And Sallie turned back to her bar with the small, satisfied air of someone who has done what needed doing and is already thinking about the next thing. She saw him watching her and raised an eyebrow. "Problem," she said. "No," he said. "The opposite." She tilted her head, considering this. Then she smiled just briefly and went back to her ledger. He sat there with his coffee and the ordinary morning light coming through the window, and the complete knowledge settled in his chest like something that had always been there and had simply now been recognized, that he would do anything to stay in the proximity of this woman for as long as he was alive. The complications arrived in December, because complications always arrive when things have just found a shape worth protecting. Denton Marsh had not forgotten October. Men like Marsh do not forget things, which is not wisdom so much as the long nursing of a grievance. He had been humiliated. A man he had never taken seriously had made him back down in front of a room full of people, and the sting of it had not faded. He had also been watching the mountain man's increasingly regular appearances at the Silver Nail, and he had added this to his calculation. And he had a hidden motive that complicated everything further. Marsh was in business with a man named Avery Holt, who held certain interests in Deadwood property, including a standing offer for the Silver Nail saloon that Harold Gibbs had so far declined. Holt wanted the property. Marsh wanted the satisfaction of herding Jeremiah Ford, and someone had given them a map, or rather a suggestion, of how these two separate desires might be served with a single action. The plan, which was not sophisticated but was effective in the blunt way of things that are not sophisticated, was to remove Sallie Ralston from Deadwood. Not by violence, not directly. Marsh was unpleasant but not stupid, and he knew that Jeremiah Ford was the kind of man who would not sit still for something like that. The plan was to create a situation in which Harold Gibbs, under financial pressure from Holt, would have no choice but to close the saloon or sell, at which point Sallie's position would disappear, and she would have nowhere to stay and no income, and the practical reality of a woman alone in Deadwood in winter without resources would do Marsh's work for him. Holt began calling in debts that Harold Gibbs owed to him, demanding repayment on a timeline that was technically legal and practically ruinous. Gibbs, who had borrowed money during a difficult previous winter, found himself in the specific trap of someone who has trusted a handshake in a place where handshakes mean what the more powerful party decides they mean. Sallie saw the financial distress in the accounts before Gibbs told her about it. She had been keeping the books carefully, and the incoming revenue was solid, but the debt pressure was of a different order. She sat down with Gibbs one morning and laid it out with the same precision she brought to every argument, and Harold Gibbs, who was not entirely without decency, told her the full shape of the situation. "Holt wants this building," Gibbs said. "He has been patient about it for 2 years. Now he is being less patient. Can you negotiate the repayment timeline?" Sallie asked. "I have tried," Gibbs said. "He is not interested in negotiation." "Then we need to find the money," she said. Gibbs looked at her. "You have ideas." "I always have ideas," she said. "Give me time." She did not tell Jeremiah immediately. She worked on it herself for 3 days, going through the books, calculating what was possible, drafting letters to suppliers about improved terms. She was not someone who asked for help before she had tried every independent option, and this was both a strength and occasionally a limitation. She told him on the 4th day because the problem was larger than her independent options, and she trusted him with it, which was itself a thing that surprised her, the ease with which she trusted him, the absence of any anxiety in the telling. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than avoiding. "Holt and Marsh are working together," he said. "That is what Gibbs believes," she said. He turned his coffee cup. "How much is the debt?" she told him. He was quiet again. Then he said, "I have money." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "From the claim," he said. "Clay and I had a productive season before he died. I sold the claim. The money has been sitting. I do not spend much on the mountain." The offer was so unexpected and so simply made without drama or expectation of anything in return that for a moment she could not speak. When she found her voice, she said, "Jeremiah, I cannot ask you to do that." "You did not ask," he said. "I offered." "It is too much," she said. "It is sitting in a bank in Deadwood doing nothing while a man who shot my partner, and has been doing whatever he likes in this town for years, prepares to take something that matters to me," he said, and the clarity and force of this was such that she went entirely still. Then she said quietly, "Something that matters to you." He met her eyes. "The saloon," he said, and then after a pause, "the person in it." They looked at each other across the bar in the December morning quiet, and everything that had been building since October was suddenly very present in the room. "I would need to pay it back," she said finally. "All of it. I would not accept it otherwise." "Agreed," he said. "I mean it, Jeremiah." "I know you mean it," he said. "That is not why I'm offering. I am not offering it to bind you to anything." She looked at him for a long moment with those direct brown eyes. "I know that too," she said. "That is why I will accept it." The repayment of Harold Gibbs's debt to Avery Holt, made through a third party in cash so that Holt did not immediately know where the money had come from, changed the shape of the game significantly. Holt lost his leverage point, and the foreclosure he had been engineering became impossible. But it did not end the problem, because Marsh was not a man who accepted the removal of his leverage without finding another. He found it in the form of a lie. The lie was simple and precisely targeted. He began saying, in the places where men gathered and talked, that Jeremiah Ford was not what he seemed, that the story of Clay Doss's death was not the story people knew, that Jeremiah had not found his partner dead, but had in fact killed him himself for the claim, and had manufactured the story of ambush to cover what was actually a murder. It was completely fabricated. There had been witnesses. There had been a marshal's inquiry. There had never been any evidence of anything other than what Jeremiah had said. But Marsh was counting on something he understood about small towns, that a lie told with enough confidence in enough places develops a life independent of its truth value, and that a man who will not speak cannot defend himself against what is said. The story spread in that particular organic way of damaging things, touching people who wanted to believe the worst about the silent, strange man on the mountain, finding purchase in imaginations already predisposed to suspicion. Sallie heard it on a Wednesday afternoon from two women who came in for tea and talked about it in the loud way of people who want to be overheard. She had served them their tea, and her face had remained entirely composed, and when they left she had gone to the back of the kitchen and stood very still for approximately 2 minutes while she managed what she was feeling. What she was feeling was a fury so clean and complete that it had its own kind of cold clarity. She knew it was not true. She did not need evidence or corroboration. She had spent 2 months talking to Jeremiah Ford at a depth that most people never reach with each other, and she knew the shape of his soul as clearly as she knew the shape of this bar. A man capable of murdering his closest friend for profit does not mourn that friend 5 years later with the particular quiet grief that she had heard in every word Jeremiah had spoken about Clay Doss. She found out where Marsh was drinking that evening, and she went there. She did not take anyone with her. She walked into the rougher establishment 3 doors down from the Silver Nail at 7 in the evening, and found Marsh at a table with 2 of his associates, and she stood in front of him with her hands at her sides and her voice steady. "I know what you are doing," she said. "I know the story you are telling about Jeremiah Ford, and I know it is a lie, and I want you to understand that I will not sit quietly while you say it." Marsh looked at her with the particular amusement of a man who does not take women seriously as opponents. "Is that right?" he said. "I know about you and Holt," she said. "I know about the pressure on the Silver Nail. I know this is all connected. And I want you to understand that you have underestimated what I am prepared to do to protect someone who does not deserve what you are doing to him." Marsh's expression shifted, not to anything like fear but to a recalculated assessment. He said, "You are very attached to that mountain man." "I am attached to the truth," she said, "and to the people worth protecting." She held his gaze until he looked away, which he did, and then she turned and walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she was back on the street, not with fear, though there had been an element of risk in what she had done. With the release of the adrenaline of it, the plain physiological response to having done a frightening thing, regardless of whether you are afraid. Jeremiah found out what she had done through the usual mechanism of a small town, which is that someone always tells someone, and the someone who told him was old Pete Briggs, who ran the feed store, and who had developed an inexplicable affection for the mountain man, over their 5 years of mostly silent commercial transactions. He came into the Silver Nail the following morning before it had officially opened, knocked on the locked door, and waited. She opened the door with her hair still half down and coffee in her hand and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been expecting a conversation. "You went to Marsh," he said. "I did," she said. "Alone." "I am an adult woman," she said. "I am aware of what alone means." He stood in the doorway and the December cold came in around him, and something was happening in his expression that she had not seen before, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear but contained elements of both. "You should not have done that without telling me," he said. "If I had told you, you would have gone in my place," she said, "or with me. And your presence would have made it a different kind of confrontation." "My presence would have protected you," he said. "I did not need protection," she said. "I needed him to understand that I am not someone who can be pushed into silence. That is something I needed to do myself." He stood there in the doorway for a long moment, and she could see him working through it, the worry, the helpless anger of not being able to keep someone safe if that someone will not be kept. "You could have been hurt," he said finally, and his voice was quieter now, the edge of it. "I could have been," she said. "I was not. I handled it." "I know you handled it," he said. "That does not change the fact that when Pete told me what you had done, He stopped. She waited. "I could not breathe for a moment," he said, "when I thought about what could have gone wrong." The morning light was coming through the saloon's dusty window behind her and catching the steam from her coffee cup, and she looked at him in the doorway with the December air cold around his shoulders, and something in her chest was very full. "Come inside," she said. "It is cold." He came in. She closed the door. She poured him a coffee and they sat down at the bar together, and after a moment she said, "I know about the story he is spreading." Jeremiah was quiet. "I know it is a lie," she said. He looked at his coffee. "You do not have to say anything about it," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I know. There will be people who believe it," he said. "There are already people who want to believe the worst of me. It is easier for them than accepting that a person can be quiet and private and not be a monster," she said. "Yes, I know. People are lazy that way." He looked at her then directly, and the thing in his expression was open in a way she had not seen before. "Why are you not afraid of me?" he said. "You have never been afraid of me from the first minute." She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. "Because you are not frightening," she said. "You are careful, there is a difference." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have not had someone in my corner in 5 years." "You have someone now," she said. They sat in the quiet morning saloon with their coffee, the winter light on the dusty window, and the understanding between them was complete in all the ways that mattered, even without the specific words for it yet. The confrontation with Marsh's lie required a public answer, and this was the thing Jeremiah had to give himself. He was not a man who liked the public arena. The whole structure of his life had been built on avoiding it. But he understood, and Sallie understood, and they discussed it together over 2 evenings in careful, honest conversation, that the only thing that would actually kill the story Marsh was spreading was a visible presence and a clear statement. The opportunity came when the weekly town meeting was held at the Deadwood courthouse, a gathering that covered community matters and that most of the established residents attended. Jeremiah had never gone to one of these meetings in 5 years. He walked in on a Thursday evening in mid-December with Sallie beside him, her idea, and he had not argued, because she had a way of making the right ideas seem straightforward, and the effect of his entrance was significant. He did not make a speech. That would have been entirely counter to his nature and would not have been believed precisely because of its counter nature. He sat down. He listened to the regular business of the meeting. And when Avery Holt, who was also there, and who was connected to everything that Marsh had been doing, made a comment in the context of another matter that contained a veiled reference to the story about Clay Doss, Jeremiah stood up. The room went immediately silent. "My name is Jeremiah Ford," he said. "I have lived 9 miles above this town for 5 years. I know that most of you know very little about me and have formed various opinions in the absence of information. I am here tonight to provide some information. Every person in that room was absolutely still. Clay Doss was my partner and my friend, Jeremiah said. He was murdered on the trail in the winter of 1878 by men who wanted what he was carrying. I found his body the following morning. There was a marshal's inquiry. The findings are documented in the territorial records and are available to anyone who wishes to read them. The story that has been circulating this week is a lie constructed by a man who wants to benefit from creating doubt about my character, and I am telling you plainly so that you can make an informed judgment. He sat down. The silence in the room lasted approximately 4 seconds, and then it broke into the noise of 100 people all having reactions at once. Sallie, sitting beside him, did not say anything. She simply put her hand on the bar. They were in the back row. She was at the end of the bench, and her hand was very close to his on the wood, and he turned his hand and covered hers with it briefly, just for a moment. That was enough. Avery Holt, who was a businessman before he was anything else, read the room accurately and came to the practical conclusion that his investments in Deadwood would be better served by withdrawing from a situation that was becoming more costly than profitable. He sent Harold Gibbs a letter the following week withdrawing his financial pressure. Marsh left Deadwood in January, which was perhaps the most satisfying development of all, because he left not because he was driven out, nothing so dramatic, but because without Holt's backing his grievances were simply personal ones with no practical power behind them, and personal grievances without power are just annoyances, and in a town full of people building their lives, Marsh's annoyance had nowhere productive to go. Harold Gibbs, in a conversation with Sallie shortly after the new year, told her that he intended to offer her a partnership in the Silver Nail, a formal one on paper, with real ownership. She had, he said, managed the place better during his absence and in the difficult period of the last months than he had managed it in years. She came to Jeremiah with this news on a cold January afternoon with her eyes bright and her cheeks red from the walk across town, and she told him about it while she was still getting her coat off, the words tumbling out with a momentum that came from excitement she had been containing since the morning. He listened, and when she was done he was smiling. It was not a large smile. Jeremiah did not do things largely, but it was entirely real, and she had come to know that real smile at whatever size it appeared, and she valued it above most things she had encountered. "You are going to take it," he said. "I am going to take it," she confirmed. "I am negotiating the terms carefully." "Of course you are," he said. She sat down across from him and looked at him with the direct brown eyes that he had been thinking about on the mountain for 3 months now, in the morning and the evening and the specific quiet hours between 3 and 5 that had always been the hardest hours for him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. She took a breath. Sallie Ralston was not a nervous person, but she was an honest one, and honesty in the specific context of feelings she had been carefully not examining required a kind of courage that was different from the kind that walked into Denton Marsh's drinking establishment alone. "I came to Deadwood to build something," she said. "I knew that when I left St. Louis. I just did not know what it was going to be." He was very still across the table. "I have come to think," she said carefully, "that part of what I am building might include you, if that is something you would want." The afternoon was quiet around them. The stove in the corner of the back room where they were sitting was making the low, comfortable sound that stoves make in winter. Outside the window, snow was falling in the particular soft, steady way it fell in the Dakota Territory when it was serious about it. Jeremiah Ford looked at this woman across the table, this woman who had asked him a simple question in October that had somehow opened 5 years of sealed silence, who had gone to face a dangerous man alone on his behalf, who had sat beside him in a courtroom meeting and held his hand for 1 moment and meant it, who had listened to him talk about elk and creek water and the way aspen look in October light with the attention usually reserved for important things, and who had just offered him. With the same plain honesty she brought to everything, a future. "I want that," he said. "I have wanted that for some time," she exhaled. Then she smiled, the full version of it, the one that changed the light in rooms, and he felt the full force of it and did not look away. "Good," she said. "Then we are in agreement." "We are in agreement," he said. And because he was Jeremiah Ford and he did not do things slowly once he had decided, he reached across the table and took her hand, and she did not pull it back. They sat there in the winter afternoon, with the snow falling outside and the stove warm and their hands together on the table. And it was the most uncomplicated peace either of them had felt in a very long time. The winter was long in the Black Hills that year, as it often was, but it did not feel long the way previous winters had felt long to Jeremiah. He came down the mountain twice a week now, sometimes 3 times, and on days when the trail was clear enough, Sallie came up to see the cabin. The first time she came up, she had put on the most practical clothes she owned and borrowed heavier boots from a woman down the street, and walked the 9 miles with the determined energy of someone who wants to understand a person's life by seeing where they live it. The cabin was small and very clean, with the particular economy of a space managed by someone who has learned that things either serve a function or should be removed. A single main room with a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping area with a built-in bunk, a small iron stove, shelves of provisions neatly organized, tools hung on the wall, books which surprised her until it did not, because it fit the person she knew, a good-sized window facing south and east that let in the morning light. She stood in the middle of it and looked around with that particular quality of attention she brought to everything, and then she said, "It suits you." "It has served its purpose," he said. She turned to look at him. "And now I wonder if it could serve a different purpose," he said. She walked to the window and looked out at the slope of pine and the valley below and the particular quality of light that the Black Hills makes in January, which is harsh and clean and beautiful in a way that requires some adjustment before it can be fully appreciated. "It is beautiful up here," she said. "It is," he agreed, standing behind her and looking at the same view, though his attention was divided. "I would need to stay in town through the partnership negotiations," she said. "That will take some weeks." "I know that," he said. "But after," she said. "After," he agreed. She turned from the window and looked at him with the direct brown eyes and said, "Jeremiah Ford, are you asking me something?" He had thought about how to do this for approximately 2 weeks and had not landed on anything that felt adequate, because nothing felt adequate when measured against what he meant by it. So he had decided to simply say the truth of it and trust that she would hear what was in it. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the practical circumstances of either of our situations, not because of the winter or the mountain or the town. Because I spent 5 years not speaking to anyone, and you asked me a question and everything that was closed in me opened, and I do not want to close again. And the only life I want is one that you are in." She was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "was a great many words for a man who once kept a total count of 10. "You are responsible for that," he said. She crossed the cabin to him and stood close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, which she did without blinking. "Yes," she said, "my answer is yes." He brought both of his hands up and held her face with the careful precision of a man who handles things he values with extraordinary care, and he kissed her. And the cabin was warm from the stove, and the snow was outside, and the valley fell away below them, and it was an entirely adequate moment. They were married in March of 1883, when the worst of the winter had broken, and the first tentative signs of spring were making arguments along the lower slopes. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hawk, who was surprised to find that Jeremiah Ford, when present for a ceremony of his own choosing, was willing to say quite a lot of things out loud, all of them clearly meant. Harold Gibbs attended. Old Pete Briggs attended, wiping his eyes at intervals with a handkerchief that he held with great dignity. Several of the town women who had formed early opinions about the mountain man had revised those opinions over the previous months and attended with genuine warmth. Sallie wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Rapid City green wool that worked well with her coloring, and she walked into that ceremony with the bearing of a woman who had made an entirely free choice and was fully at peace with it. Jeremiah wore his best coat, which Sallie had persuaded him to have cleaned and pressed, and he stood at the front of the small church with a stillness that was not nervousness but attention. The same quality of attention she had first seen when he ate that plate of salt pork and biscuits in the Silver Nail on an October afternoon, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her with an expression so open and so complete that several of the assembled wedding guests had to look away because it felt too private to witness. The partnership papers for the Silver Nail were signed in April. Sallie's name was on the deed. Half of the building, half of the business, fully legal. She framed the paper and hung it in the back office and looked at it occasionally when she needed to remind herself that things she had worked for were real. The cabin on the mountain became their home in the spring, with modifications. Jeremiah added a room over the following summer months. He was a capable builder, as he was a capable everything he turned his hand to. And Sallie managed the saloon from town most days, making the 9-mile walk or the ride on the horse she had acquired, coming up the mountain in the evenings and on days when the business could manage without her, which it increasingly could as she built a reliable staff. They fell into a life that fit them in the specific way that good things fit, not without adjustment, not without the occasional friction of two independent and particular people sharing space, but genuinely and fundamentally suited. He learned that she read aloud when she was happy, from whatever book she was currently working through, not always expecting him to be listening but not expecting it either, and he learned that he liked this, the sound of her voice in the cabin in the evenings giving shape and character to the silence. She learned that he processed things in a different time frame than most people, that his quietness was often thought rather than distance, and that the best thing to do when he went quiet on something was to leave it alone until it came back around, which it always did, in his own time and in his own words, and always more completely than she had expected. They disagreed sometimes. About practical things, the best way to manage the saloon accounts, the wisdom of a particular expenditure, the amount of time each of them was working. They were both people with strong opinions and the capacity to defend them, which made for disagreements that were sharp-edged and honest, and were resolved with the same directness that characterized everything else about them. The summer of 1883 was warm and long in the Black Hills, and Sallie discovered that she was going to have a child in August, and she told Jeremiah about it standing in the kitchen of the cabin on a Tuesday evening while she was making biscuits and he was mending a piece of harness at the table, and she said it simply, "I am expecting a baby. In the spring, I think." He put the harness down and looked at her, and his expression went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something fierce and glad that she had no word for except that it was exactly what she had hoped to see. He stood up and came to her at the counter and put his arms around her from behind and held on with the careful strength he always used, as if she were something worth protecting with precision, and he said against her hair, "I am going to make the cabin larger." She laughed. Actually laughed, surprised out of it. "That is your first response." "My first response," he said, not letting go of her, "is something I do not have adequate words for. My second response is that we need more room." They had a son, born in April of 1884, when the last snow was melting off the mountain, and the creek below the cabin was loud with runoff. They named him James Clay Ford James for Sallie's father, Clay for the friend that Jeremiah had lost and had never stopped carrying. James was a loud and immediate and opinionated child from the first hour, which Sallie said was predictable, and Jeremiah held his son with the same careful precision he brought to things he valued, and looked at him with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something unguarded and astonished and permanent. The Silver Nail had, by this point, become one of the more reputable establishments in Deadwood, which was partly Sallie's doing and partly the natural development of a town that was growing past its roughest edges. Harold Gibbs was aging and had less interest in the daily operations, and Sallie was running the bulk of it with the same firm practical capability she had shown from the first week. She hired well. She paid fairly. She ran an honest establishment where the accounts balanced, and the customers were treated with a respect that was not universal in Deadwood's service industry, and the reputation of the place reflected this. Jeremiah, for his part, had found that the mountain was not quite the sealed world it had been before. He had not transformed into a social creature. He was never going to be that and did not want to be, but he had found a middle territory between total isolation and the social world of the town. He knew people now. Not many, but genuinely. Old Pete Briggs, who came up to the mountain occasionally to fish the creek and was perfectly happy to do so in comfortable silence. A Lakota man named Looking Elk, whose family's traditional territory included the mountain, and who had initially regarded Jeremiah with the justified wariness of a people who had learned that white settlers on their land almost never meant good things, but who had, over careful years, found in Jeremiah a man who kept his word, respected boundaries, and did not take more than he needed. This was not a simple friendship, and Jeremiah was clear-eyed about the injustice that framed it. The Lakota people had been losing land and autonomy with brutal consistency for decades, and the Dakota Territory in the 1880s was no exception to this pattern, and there was nothing Jeremiah could do about the scale of that wrong beyond conducting his own small piece of it with honesty. He and Looking Elk had conversations that were frank about this, and they managed a genuine respect that acknowledged the weight of what was between their peoples without pretending it was something simpler than it was. Sallie, when she met Looking Elk and his wife Morning Star at the mountain the following summer, was direct about the same things, and Morning Star, who had her own considerable opinions about most things, responded to Sallie's directness with the warm sharpness of someone who appreciates not being handled carefully. The children they eventually had James, and then a daughter named Ruth 2 years later, and then a second son, Thomas, 2 years after that, grew up on the mountain in the summers and in town during the school months, which was a slightly unusual arrangement, but one that fit the life Jeremiah and Sallie had built, which had always been somewhat unusual by ordinary measures. James was 7 when he asked his father, with the unsentimental curiosity of small children, why people in town called him the mountain man who never talked. Jeremiah considered this question with the seriousness he gave to most questions. "I used to not talk very much," he said. "Why?" James said. "I was sad for a long time," Jeremiah said. "What made you stop being sad?" Jeremiah looked across the cabin to where Sallie was at the table helping Ruth with the letters of the alphabet, her head bent close to their daughter's, the October afternoon light on both of them. "Someone asked me a question," he said. James considered this with the profound inadequacy of a 7-year-old's patience for incomplete answers. "What question?" "She asked if I was hungry," Jeremiah said. James looked at his mother, then back at his father. "That is not a very interesting question," he said. "It was the best question anyone ever asked me," Jeremiah said. That evening, after the children were in their beds, and the cabin was quiet with the particular full quiet of a house that has been loud all day, Sallie and Jeremiah sat at the table together, which was a thing they had done most evenings for years. Sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes just being in the same space in the comfortable way of people who have found in each other's presence a kind of home that has nothing to do with walls. She had been reading letters from her mother in St. Louis. Her mother had, gradually and with some resistance, come around to the life Sallie had built, and her letters were now warm rather than worried. Her father had visited once, in the summer of 1885, and had sat on the porch of the expanded mountain cabin with Jeremiah and watched the valley below and talked about the things that interested them both. which turned out to be a surprising number of things, and had gone back to St. Louis and told Sally's mother that the mountain man was quiet but was, in fact, one of the most substantive people he had ever met. She set the letter down and looked at Jeremiah across the table, who was working on something in his journal. He had started keeping one, at her suggestion, in the second year of their marriage, because she had told him that the way he observed and described things was worth keeping, and he had been skeptical, and then discovered that the practice of it was something he valued. "James asked me today why I do not talk to people," he said, without looking up. "I heard some of that," she said. From across the room. "He said your question was not interesting," Jeremiah said. "Children are ruthless," she said. He looked up from his journal then, across the table in the October evening firelight, and the look he gave her was the one she had been receiving for 6 years now and had never gotten tired of, entirely direct and entirely unguarded, the look of a man who no longer had any sealed rooms. "It was the most important question anyone ever asked me," he said. "I know," she said. "You told him." "It was true when I told him," he said. "It is still true." She reached across the table and put her hand over his on the journal, the way she had put her hand close to his on the bench at the courthouse meeting on that December night when everything had been in the balance, except this was not balance, and stakes and confrontation. This was the quiet end of an ordinary good day in a life built on a question asked in a saloon in October in the year 1882. "I was going to make you coffee," she said, "but the fire is comfortable and I do not want to move." "Then don't move," he said. "Are you hungry?" she said. He looked at her. She was smiling, that full version that still changed the quality of the light in rooms after 6 years and 3 children and a mountain and all the rest of it. He smiled back, his version of it not small now, not at all. "That," he said, "is still the best question." Outside, the October wind was working through the aspen on the slope, making that particular sound that is not quite a voice and not quite silence but is somewhere between the two, like something trying to speak. The fire was warm. The children were sleeping. James Clay Ford, named for a lost friend and a living father, was breathing in the steady way of children who do not know yet about the things they might lose or the ways that loss can seal a person. And somewhere in the Black Hills the creek was running in the dark, the same creek that had different voices in different seasons, the creek whose sounds Jeremiah had described to Sally on an early morning in November of 1882 while she listened as if it mattered. Which it did. Which all of it did. Which is the thing, finally, that this is about, not the silence, which was only a symptom, and not the danger, which was only the shape the world took while trying to prevent something that was going to happen anyway. It is about the question that was a door, and the man who walked through it, and the woman who held it open. In 1887, when Thomas was 3 and Ruth was 5, and James was approaching his 8th birthday with the determined intensity he brought to all things, the saloon partnership that Sally and Harold Gibbs had maintained for 4 years came to a natural end. Gibbs wanted to retire. He had family in Colorado who had been asking him to come for years. He was tired, in the good way of someone who has worked hard and knows it, and he wanted warmth and ease and the specific comfort of family in older age. He sold his half of the silver nail to Sally at a fair price, which was Gibbs's version of generosity. He could have held out for more from other buyers, and he didn't. The day the paperwork was signed and the building was entirely hers, Sally walked the length of the silver nail from the back of the kitchen to the front door and back, the way she had on her first day when she was learning the geography of her new situation, and then she sat down at the bar on the customer's side. She had developed a habit of occasionally sitting on that side, the side where she had first sat beside Jeremiah rather than across from him, the side where the change of perspective mattered. And she put her hands on the worn wood of the bar that she now fully owned and felt the specific weight and freedom of that. Jeremiah was waiting outside. He had come down the mountain with her for the signing, left the horse at the livery. When she came out, she was carrying the framed partnership papers that she was going to retire and replace with the new sole ownership document, and her face had the look it had sometimes, not happy exactly, or not only happy but settled, like a person who has arrived at a place they intended to reach. "It is done," she said. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Like being 26 in St. Louis and knowing you are going to do something your mother will have opinions about, but doing it anyway." He took the frame from her and tucked it under his arm so her hands were free. "Good opinions or bad ones in the end. She is coming to visit in May," Sallie said, "with my father. She has asked specifically if the children know their Bible verses, which I have taken as an indication that her concerns have shifted in a positive direction." He offered her his arm, the other arm, free of the frame, and she took it, and they walked down the Deadwood street in the late afternoon light of a September day in 1887, in a town that was older and somewhat quieter than it had been in 1882, the worst of the boom years behind it now. The people who had stayed being mostly the people who had decided to build something rather than just extract something. And the town had that quality of settling into itself, of becoming rather than just being. They were known on that street. The mountain man who had married the saloon woman, or the saloon woman who had married the mountain man, depending on whose story you put at the center, which was its own argument about perspective. He spoke now, in the way he spoke economically precisely, with the occasional observation that caught people off guard with its accuracy. She spoke the way she had always spoken, directly and with her full mind behind it. They were, in the way that matters most, completely themselves. The walk to the livery took them past Colburn's General Store, and without particularly planning to, both of them slowed as they passed it, the way you slow near a place that has a significance in your personal history. It was just a store. Flour and salt and nails and lamp oil and the ordinary materials of ordinary frontier life, and the counter where Jeremiah had laid his coins for 5 years without a word, and the door through which he had walked on an October afternoon toward a sound he had heard from the Silver Nail across the street. "Do you think about it?" she said. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think when you think about it?" He looked at the door of the general store and then at her and said, with the plain honesty that was the foundation of everything between them, "I think about what another year of it would have cost me, and then I am grateful for the question." She leaned into his arm slightly, the small, comfortable weight of it. "I think about it too," she said. "I think about what I would have missed, the whole of it. This town, this life, you, the children, all of it, hanging on whether I asked one ordinary question." "It was not ordinary," he said. "You would have found another question. You have always had more questions than most." She laughed. "That has been said about me less kindly." "I mean it kindly," he said. "Your questions are why everything opened." They collected the horse from the livery and made their way out of town and up the long mountain trail as the September light was going gold over the Black Hills. And James Clay Ford, who had come down that afternoon with his father, was running ahead on the trail with the particular inexhaustible energy of a boy who has not yet learned to be tired. And Ruth was on the saddle in front of Sallie with her small, serious face, watching the trail with an attention she had inherited from her father. And Thomas was asleep against Jeremiah's chest in the carrier that Jeremiah had built from the design of one he had seen with a Lakota family, and adapted to his own specifications, the way he adapted. Most things practically, carefully, without making a larger thing of it than it was. The mountain received them the way it always did, indifferent to human dramas in the best possible way, steady and old and entirely itself, asking nothing except that you pay attention to it and give it the respect its scale deserves. The cabin was warm when they got there because the stove had been banked that morning, and the October cold had not yet fully replaced the September warmth. The children were fed and bathed and put to bed with the gentle efficiency of 2 parents, who had divided these tasks between them with the natural negotiation of people who are genuinely trying to do them well, rather than just trying to do them. When the cabin was quiet and the fire was low, and the October stars were doing their particular brilliant work in the Black Hills sky outside the window, Sallie sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea, and Jeremiah came and sat beside her with his own cup, and they were quiet together for a while, which was a thing they could do better than most. Below them, the valley was dark, and the lights of Deadwood were small and steady in the distance, and the creek was talking to itself in the October voice it used at this time of year. And Jeremiah Ford, who had not spoken more than 10 words to anyone in 5 years, until a woman asked him if he was hungry, sat beside his wife on the porch of a home that was genuinely his, not as territory to be defended, but as a place where he was known and wanted. And he felt the full weight of what his life had become. He had not been good at words once. He had lost faith in their usefulness, in their ability to bridge the distance between people, in the value of reaching toward another human when reaching could end with clay dots frozen on a trail. But here now, with the darkness around them and the stars above and his children breathing in their beds inside, and this woman beside him who had walked into his silence with a question, and refused to be frightened by what she found there, he understood that words were not the bridge. They were just the form the bridge took. The bridge itself was something older and less articulable, the decision to try again after loss, the courage of a plain question asked to a stranger, the willingness to let something that was closed be opened. "It is cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The creek ran in the dark below. The stars did their brilliant work above. The children slept. And the mountain that had been a sealed place for 5 years breathed around a cabin that was, entirely and permanently, a home.